Hello, Blythe, Evie, Joe, Jack, Callum, and Cadence. During the coronavirus, I have decided to read a different story to you every day and send it to your mom and dad as a video so that you can look at the book and listen to the story while I'm reading it. I've chosen ones that maybe you haven't seen before, and I'll introduce the books one at a time and for each day, and then read it so you can look at the pictures while I'm reading it. So here goes. So the title of this book is My Grandma Lived in Gooligulch, written by someone named Graham Bass. And it was given to Florence as a gift from her granddaddy and grandmother in 1992. It says, "Happy, happy birthday, granddaddy and grandmother, 1992. So she would have been, 89, 9, she would have been 3 years old. So here we go. It comes from Australia. It's written by a man who lives in Australia, so there's lots and lots of Australian words. But the grandma is a really fun person, too. So it starts. My grandma lived in Gooligulch near Bandywallop East, a fair way north of Murrumbun, 500 miles at least. A little west of Lawson's Rest and south of Johnson's Gap, but nowhere much near anywhere that shows up on the map. Now, Gooligulch has got a pub, a main street with a hall, a petrol pump that doesn't work, and not much else at all, except for Grandma, dear old Gran. And this I say with pride, for Gran it was that made old Gooly famous far and wide. So there she is. She's pointing to Gooligulch in outback Australia. There you can see a picture of the sign, Gooligulch, population 312. And there's some kangaroos, and you can see the outback, the pictures of the outback. Those are termite hills, like ant hills. And this is what is that bird called? Ooh, I can't remember. I'll have to look it up and tell you. Okay, so here goes more. In Sydney and in Melbourne town, they all knew Grandma's name and all about the animals that Grandma used to tame. And if a stranger came to town, perhaps just passing through, he'd see my grandma riding by atop a kangaroo, or sometimes in a two-wheeled gig, a wombat at the bit, and next to Grandma in the back, a bandicoot would sit. The townsfolk thought it very odd, but Grandma took no heed. She said that she enjoyed the view upon her hopping steed. And as for training wombats, well, it took no time at all to teach them how to pull a gig and come and go at call. So there she is, riding her kangaroo. Now we see her riding in a carriage pulled by a wombat. There's the Gooligulch Hotel. That's what they call petrol in Australia. It's gas. When they say a petrol station, they mean a gas station. This says Patterson Municipal Hall. When they say there's a hall, that means it's like a community meeting area. And there is the bandicoot sitting next to Grandma in her in the wagon. Now, Grandma lived just out of town, a mile beyond the pub, down by a little billabong that nestled in the scrub. Upon a hillside ringed with trees, her rambling mansion stood, a jumbled maze of tin and canvas, bits of string and wood. And from a window out the back, she'd sit and watch galahs fly down beside the pool and drink beneath the evening stars. Now, these birds are all called galahs, and grandmother, your mom's grandmother, and my mother, because she grew up in Australia, when we would do something silly, she would sometimes say, "You silly galah," which just meant, "You crazy little bird, what are you doing?" In years gone by, the house was full of birds, both big and small, rosellas, eagles, coots, and magpies roosting in the hall, while in the tiny living room an old goanna sat and played a game of two-up with a dingo and a rat. My grandma whiled the hours away conversing with a coot, or listening to the wombat play a tune upon his lute. Oh, you see all the birds? And now this is a guana playing two up. It's a game with coins that you guess. You toss the coin up, kind of like heads or tails. And then that's a dingo, which is what they call a wild dog in Australia. And there's a rat. And they're playing that in Grandma's living room. There was a time, the locals say, when emus came to dine and stood about all evening drinking eucalyptus wine. They dressed for the occasion looking rather out of date and were spreading idle gossip in a less than sober state. But then a frill-necked lizard gave one ancient bird a scare, and the dinner guests all panicked, running madly here and there. Some kookaburras heard the noise and came to watch the show and laughed so much that Grandma sternly told them all to go. By the time the fuss was over, there was not a guest in sight. But then that's the way with emus, Grandma said. They're not too bright. So here's all the emus making a mess of things and knocking things over, and so all the guests left. So one year when it was very hot, old Grandma went away and took the wombat with her on a seaside holiday. She didn't go by elephant or on a polar bear. Besides, you ought to know you don't find elephants up there. She didn't own a camel, and they cost too much to buy. So Grandma bought some goggles and decided she would fly. The eagle wouldn't take them, and the coot was far too weak, but a pelican consented, so they climbed into its beak, and off they flew, quite low at first, then climbing very high, and as they turned toward the sea, the wombat waved goodbye. That's a picture of camels, but Grandma didn't buy a camel. She got a pelican to take her. And so it's Grandma and the pelican flying away with the wombat with her. The wombat waves goodbye when they're leaving. They're leaving Gooligulch, and they're flying inside the beak of the pelican. See how Grandma's butt's sitting inside the pelican's mouth, and the wombat is just hanging on the side and waving his little spotted kerchief. They flew across the desert sands and over mountains too, until at dusk they reached a place where giant tree ferns grew. The pelican came gliding down to land beside a creek, and Grandma and the wombat climbed down gladly from its beak. Then while the pelican relaxed and Grandma cooked the tea, the wombat wandered down the creek to see what he could see. So there they've landed, and there's the creek. So the wombat wants to go down to the creek to see what he can see. Ooh, and look at all the different wildlife. There's the wombat. There's different birds flying. There's the pelican is right there with Grandma. That's like their campsite. There's a porcupine, a platypus, and then something with a tail that's up against the palms, the palm fronds there. The trees were full of creatures with unfriendly, glowing eyes, and giant furry spiders hunted giant furry flies. A baby tree snake slithered by and gave him such a start that poor old wombat turned and fled with terror in his heart. And so they spent the night there, but the wombat stayed awake, looking nervously around him for a wombat-eating snake. There's a snake, and then look what it's like for the wombat all night. He's looking, watching the animals, wanting to make sure that there is not a wombat-eating snake anywhere nearby. When morning came, they journeyed on and reached the sea at last. The rolling waves came crashing in. The tide was running fast. But undeterred, my grandma donned her frilly bathing gear and dived into the foaming surf without a trace of fear. She sat upon her blow-up horse while Wombat went to sleep. The pelican went fishing where the sea was not so deep. But when the wombat woke, the tide had carried her away, and no one's seen my grandma even to this very day. So there's Grandma swimming off. So where do you think she went? Oh my goodness. Look, there she is, surrounded by seagulls in the big waves, riding her blow-up seahorse. Ooh, she's having fun. That's a fun grandma, isn't it? And yet I have a feeling that my grandma is still alive, having drifted to an island where she'd managed to survive. From there, perhaps she made her way to England or to Spain, or maybe San Francisco on a Western railway train. She could be taming tigers in the jungles of Tingur. So do you see? She could be landed on an island where she's surviving just fine, or she got on a boat and went to England or Spain, or maybe even San Francisco on the Western train, or she could even be taming tigers in the jungles of Tingur. But I think she's back in Gooligulch, just like before. So there she is, going home, back to her mansion in Gooligulch. And there's a koala up in the tree, and there's parrots, and there's emus, and that's her home sweet home. And that is the end. This is My Grandma Lived in Gooligulch by Graham Bass. So, Blythe, Evie, Joe, Jack, Callum, Cadence, I hope you enjoyed that story. Tomorrow, we're going to read this one. We're going to read Hieronymus Betts and His Unusual Pets. So stay tuned for tomorrow's story time. Love you all. Bye-bye.